As soon as Siad Barre exited Mogadishu and Somalia, the country descended into a civil war.
He has got a mixed history. His role in history is going to be looked at negatively.
When Siad Barre was disposed, the Islamic Union took over.
The Somali themselves don't have a history of pledging allegiance to a central authority.
Somebody realized the power of religion, to use religion to get political power.
It is quite clear, if, for example, your act or attitude is danger to your very existence, it is logic. How can you have a good relation?
In 1995, Mohamed Siad Barre passed away in Lagos. 4 years after his ouster in Somalia, few mourned his demise.
Siad Barre became a completely isolated leader. His leadership was rejected. He became authoritarian, and he used enormous force to suppress rebellions in the country, which set the country for disintegration eventually, and the collapse that we are witnessing today.
Once he failed in that war, he could not hold the center together, and I think eventually his government had to actually collapse because he did not enjoy any legitimacy.
As Barre fled, the external branch of the United Somali Congress, one of the rebel groups involved in ousting him, declared Ali Mahdi president of the country. But this was contested by another faction led by Mohamed Iidid.
Farah Iidid was also disposed of. So the elements of the Islamic Union had their own agenda. They had what they believed was right for Somalia, especially the Islamic Sharia law.
The ensuing civil war engulfed Mogadishu with many civilian deaths. The violence became strictly clan-based. The Darood were targeted as mortal enemies of all other Somalis, even though the great majority had received no benefit from the previous regime.
Before the civil war, Mogadishu was like any other city, very organized actually, clean, and the services were being delivered. Of course, towards the end of Siad Barre's regime. But when the civil war started, Mogadishu became a very chaotic, disastrous, ruinous city where each and every clan was actually fighting for a patch of Mogadishu. There were massive killings, human rights abuses, and basically terrorism. Each clan was terrorizing the other in their pursuit for power, in their pursuit for control of specific areas in Mogadishu.
By 1992, the disruption to agricultural communities led to a famine in which 250,000 are thought to have died. This paved the way for international intervention in military and humanitarian form.
So United Nations deployed peacekeepers to protect its food, humanitarian convoys. Some of these peacekeepers were attacked by one, mainly, Farah Iidid, who was the major warlord controlling Mogadishu. His personnel killed some 24 personnel from the Pakistani peacekeeping contingent. And the UN called on assistance from the superpowers to help, particularly in Mogadishu, to protect its humanitarian convoy.
A joint US-UN military force entered the country in December of that year. Initially under the banner of UNITAF, United Nations Task Force, it morphed into UNISOM, and eventually UNISOM II. The interclan violence was now supplemented by fighting between locals and the international forces, who were also found to have committed gross human rights violations against local civilians. Local disenchantment with the US-UN alliance reached a peak on September 9, 1993, when a US helicopter fired on an unarmed crowd, killing about 60 people. Worse was to come at the beginning of October, when an attempt to kill or capture Iidid became an overnight standoff that led to the Battle of Mogadishu, Black Hawk Down. As the operation was being carried out, Somali forces shot down 2 helicopters with rocket-propelled grenades.
If you to look carefully at why the United States actually got involved in Mogadishu at that time, post-Cold War, the doctrine was to preemptively strike at countries that were going to pose a threat to the United States of America. And this was one of the major drivers of why the United States got involved in Somalia, other than pursuing humanitarian objectives.
In the aftermath of the battle, dead American soldiers were dragged through the streets by Somalis. This was shown on American television, leading to a public outcry.
The US citizen could not understand what they were seeing on CNN then. They called the US administration to return their soldiers back home out of Somalia.
Fear of a repeat of this battle led the US-UN mission eventually to pull out of Somalia in 1995.
After the Battle of Mogadishu, Mogadishu just became it was wrecked. It was ruined. The people that were, particularly in those quarters where the military action took place, basically left because buildings were just left in ruins.
It became apparent that they were not going to manage. Some broke off, and I think that is the birth of Shabaab.
Somalia's turmoil was never limited to the country's borders. The threat to the region's security became worse with the formation of Al-Shabaab, the youth, an insurgent group whose aim was to establish an Islamic state in the country.
People emphasizing, well, we need to mobilize the youth to push a particular agenda that is Somali in essence, but also Islamic. And anyone who disagrees with us is a problem.
They started recruiting young men who went to school and did not have jobs, others who were indoctrinated and did not understand themselves. They are pulled into the situation without knowing where they're heading to, but end up being agents of Al-Shabaab.
Al-Shabaab now is a reaction to statelessness in Somalia. And it has morphed now into a mafioso gang now. Before, when the religious leaders from Pakistan were at the head, there was some kind of ideological focus. But now they're collecting money in the streets of Mogadishu.
The way they started enforcing their wishes is using those terror tactics, not just in Kenya because they have used them in Kenya, but in Somalia itself. So anyone who disagrees with them ends up being blown.
Since its inception, Al-Shabaab has targeted Kenya more than other frontline states because of the exposure that comes from Kenya's international visibility. The Kenyan media are unrestricted, so they publicize terrorist attacks around the world. The highly developed tourism sector in particular provides soft targets for Al-Shabaab operations. On the Somali border, Mandera is particularly vulnerable to Al-Shabaab attacks. In 2019, 2 Cuban doctors were kidnapped, although they were subsequently released.
Al-Shabaab was very strong. They are all over the place. But Kenya has been able to move in very quickly and stop their movement and also control them. But Kenya suffer as a result of that. So many of our soldiers have lost their life as a result of what's happening in Somalia.
Such attacks are not limited to the border area. In 2012, Yusuf Hassan nearly lost his life when a grenade was thrown at him outside a mosque in Nairobi, killing 5 people in his vicinity.
I was rushed to the Aga Khan and both my legs were shattered. And it took me about 2 to 3 years, I think, for me to be able to get up and walk again. We never got to the bottom of this particular incident, but it had all the hallmarks of a terrorist organization. It was professionally executed. They left no trace. It was well planned. They must have been waiting. And my assumption is it is certainly one of the extremist groups, if not Al-Shabaab itself.
Al-Shabaab can launch unexpected attacks anywhere in Kenya. We've seen major incidents at Garissa, Manda Bay on the coast, and Westgate shopping mall in the centre of Nairobi.
They are fighting modernity. They are fighting the institutions of education. When they attack Kenya, they attack universities. They attack places of leisure. They attack beach hotels because they are opposed to this modern idea of people living in a time and place where these functionalities occur.
Many other attempts have been thwarted, but security considerations mean that they can't be discussed openly.
They have recruited people from the refugee camps, they have recruited people from this country, and I think, I'm not sure if we will destroy Al-Shabaab, we can only reduce their activities.
We are not stuck with them, but it's going to be not a short flight, it's a long haul to get them out, because somebody somewhere is benefiting from what Al-Shabaab is doing, both within and outside Somalia. So it's going to be a long time. We need to strategize, to be able to get rid of Shabaab or change their ideology, because for them, it's ideology.
They're a primeval danger that needs to be defeated totally. There cannot be any communications, talking, because they represent a worldview that is just outrageous and not acceptable for us in the 21st century.
Nowhere is the threat to international security from Somalia's unrest more evident than in the waters of the Indian Ocean. Piracy in particular has led to the demise of Kenya as a cruise ship destination. Lamu Port marks the entry point of Lapset, an ambitious transport corridor that was designed to open South Sudan and Ethiopia to the sea. Until security improves, Lapset's impact will be negligible.
When they attack that, they say something about the Al-Shabaab because they're retrogressive. They want to go to the past, but we're living in the present. So there's a political confusion among them. By this return to the past, this dangerous idea of going back to some place in history where we can make things work is like a common day time travel. It's impossible.
Somalia's tragedy is that so many cynical interests keep fanning the flames of violence, not least by continually supplying arms to insurgent groups.
Religion for me is very emotive. Religion promises a reward beyond this world. The easiest way to mobilize the people, get support, both within and outside, is talk about religion, talk about Islam. And for me, that is the history of Al-Shabaab. How can we make use of Islam, mobilize masses, get into government? And this is what they're doing even now. And of course, for it to be appealing, we want to establish an Islamic State.
There's some irony in the fact that partners in the so-called global war on terror can also turn a blind eye to suppliers of weapons in the region.
The international community is involved in Somalia in a very, very negative way. There is massive, one of the largest deposits of oil, minerals, all these kinds are over there. And the Gulf states don't want another competitor in the oil industry, I presume. People tend to think that that's a conspiratorial kind of rhetoric, but I think that material interests influence states to act in a certain way.
So what can be done to improve relations between Somalia and Kenya? What action can be taken to bring peace to the Horn?